Sorry, sir. Wearing a shiny necklace doesn't mean you deserve first class. The gate agent scoffed, eyeing the Medal of Honor around his neck. Colonel Jack Whitmore didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply stepped aside, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. And then, Denver International Airport went silent. Every plane grounded. Passengers stared as black government SUVs tore across the tarmac. But this wasn't a terrorist threat. No bomb, no storm. Just one quiet man in uniform, denied a seat he paid for because a gate agent said medals don't buy first class. 9 minutes later, the Pentagon answered his call. What happened next silenced the entire airport. Colonel Jack Whitmore moved through the crowded terminal of Denver International, not with urgency, but with the quiet purpose of a man who'd spent most of his life making each step count. He wasn't running late. He wasn't trying to draw attention. And he definitely wasn't wearing the medal around his neck for anyone in that terminal. The Medal of Honor rested on his chest like a weight heavier than its metal form, a sky blue ribbon trimmed with white stars and a 5-pointed star of gold, one of the rarest distinctions in the U.S. military. But to Jack, it wasn't a badge of honor. It was a tombstone he carried around his neck. He was 54 years old now, decades removed from the chaos of Iraq, but never truly free of it. His body had healed over time, but his mind still kept the worst parts perfectly preserved. The worst day of his life was also the one the government had chosen to enshrine. Jack wasn't flying to D.C. for any ceremony, any press, or any political gathering. He was traveling to Arlington National Cemetery. Tomorrow morning at 0800 hours, the man who had saved his life, his former squad leader, Sergeant First Class David Rios, would be lowered into the earth with full military honors. David had taken bullets so Jack could live. And in the 18 years that followed, Jack had done everything he could to earn that second chance. It still didn't feel like enough. Flashback, Fallujah, Iraq. November 2006. The air was thick with dust and the metallic sting of cordite. The patrol had been routine until it wasn't. They'd entered a narrow alley near Sector 17, and within seconds the world exploded. 2 IEDs hit first. Then came the gunfire. A carefully orchestrated ambush with 3 lines of insurgents waiting for them. The first 30 seconds had taken the lives of 3 soldiers. Jack remembered their names, their laughs, and the way they screamed when the ambush began. What he didn't remember was making the decision to run headfirst into that alley again and again. 7 times. 7 times Jack had sprinted through enemy fire to pull wounded men from the line of death. Bullets had traced the air around him. Mortar shells had dropped just short of their mark. On his 6th trip, Jack stumbled while dragging a wounded private. He was pinned exposed, and that's when Sergeant Rios stepped out from cover. David didn't hesitate. He stepped into the open and laid down suppressive fire with his saw, drawing the enemy's attention and taking 2 shots to the chest and 1 through the thigh. Somehow he stayed upright long enough for Jack to finish the rescue. They both survived that day. Barely. Jack was airlifted out and treated for shrapnel injuries and exhaustion. David, on the other hand, would never walk the same again. He spent 12 years in and out of VA hospitals, quietly battling physical pain and emotional trauma. Eventually, it was the PTSD that proved more fatal than the bullets. Jack had given dozens of speeches about courage since then, had stood beside presidents and generals. But all those honors meant nothing if he couldn't show up to say goodbye to the man who made them possible. Back in the terminal, Jack stood still as passengers flowed around him like a stream against a boulder. He reached up and gently touched the metal, not to display it, but to ground himself. This flight, this seat wasn't about privilege. It was about making sure a widow saw one man who hadn't forgotten. And that's why being denied it by someone who saw only a ribbon and not a reason cut deeper than any enemy fire ever had. The Medal of Honor didn't matter to the gate agent, but to Jack Whitmore it had never mattered more. Gate 42 at Denver International Airport bustled with the usual rhythm of boarding calls and rolling luggage. Screens flickered with updates, passengers tapped away at phones, and families gathered in rows of molded plastic seats. Among them stood Colonel Jack Whitmore, composed upright and unmistakably military. His dress uniform was immaculate, his face weathered but calm. A folded copy of his itinerary peeked from the side pocket of his carry-on. He approached the counter as the flight to Washington, D.C. prepared to board first class. Behind the desk stood Alyssa Kerr, 29, an airline gate agent, with the kind of corporate polish that comes from 3 years of saying, "I'm sorry, that's policy," hundreds of times a day. She didn't look up right away. Her fingers clicked across the keyboard, rehearsed and detached. When she finally acknowledged him, her eyes flicked down to the metal hanging around his neck, then back up to his face. "Sir," she said flatly, "your reservation has been flagged." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Flagged? You must have used a military discount, and it looks like the system wants a fare adjustment before you can board first class." She offered a practiced smile, the kind that signaled the conversation was already over. Jack remained composed. "Ma'am, I paid full fare for this ticket 3 weeks ago. No discount was used." Alyssa shrugged, tapping again. "Sometimes that happens when veterans try to upgrade after check-in. The system assumes it's a courtesy request." Jack reached calmly into his bag and pulled out the receipt. "This is my confirmation number and proof of payment. First class, full fare, no discount." She barely glanced at the screen. "Look, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just telling you what the system says. I can assign you to a coach seat, but unless you pay the balance now, I can't board you in first class." Jack leaned in, voice steady. "There is no balance," but her mind was already made up. She leaned back on one foot and muttered with just enough volume to sting, "Some people think a shiny metal gets them extra privileges." Jack's spine straightened, not out of pride but restraint. He had faced enemy fire explosions and trauma that never left him. But this was a different kind of insult, one that masqueraded as policy but bled with condescension. He didn't lash out. He didn't raise his voice. He simply placed the paper on the counter with precision. "This isn't about privilege," he said, voice low. "It's about honoring a fallen soldier I owe my life to, and catching this flight is the only way to do it." Alyssa clicked her mouse. "Sir, I'm just doing my job." Passengers nearby began to take notice. A few heads turned. One man nudged his wife. A teenager started filming quietly from the corner with a smartphone. They didn't know who Jack Whitmore was, but something felt off, like watching a judge berate a preacher during a funeral. A TSA officer wandered over but paused as he saw the Medal of Honor glint in the terminal lights. Still, the situation continued. Alyssa remained firm. "You can take coach, or you can wait for a different flight," she repeated. "Those are your options." Jack looked past her to the gate. The first-class passengers were now lined up and boarding. The gate door remained open. "I'm asking you to review the reservation properly," Jack said one last time. But she didn't. Instead, she tapped a key. With a soft, hydraulic hiss, the jet bridge door closed. A dull thud echoed across the gate area. Flight 2178 was pushing back from the terminal, its wheels turning, engines spooling. Jack's seat 2A would fly to Washington without him. The colonel turned to the window arms at his side. On the other end of that aircraft sat an empty seat and a ticking clock. Tomorrow's funeral at Arlington would begin whether he was there or not. Alyssa looked down, already moving on to the next boarding group. Jack remained still, a silhouette against the terminal glass as the aircraft taxied away. The moment passed like a gust of wind, but not for those who saw it happen. Not for the veteran who had been treated like an inconvenience. Not for the passengers watching in silence as honor was quietly pushed aside. And certainly not for the woman behind the counter who had no idea who she had just turned away. Jack Whitmore stood still as the aircraft disappeared into the overcast Denver sky. The chill in the terminal air didn't come from the air conditioning, it came from the ache of helplessness. It had been years since he'd felt this particular kind of weight. Not the kind you carry in combat, but the kind that comes when people in power treat service like an inconvenience. His seat 2A was gone, so was the flight. So was the only timely way to say goodbye to the man who'd once stepped into enemy fire to save him. But Jack hadn't survived wars by accepting dead ends. He stepped back from the window, unzipped his laptop bag, and pulled out his phone. His fingers hovered for a second over a contact he hadn't dialed in over 2 years. General Marissa Delaney, Pentagon Chief of Staff, former battalion commander. The woman who had pinned the Bronze Star on his chest in Iraq. The woman who had stood behind the sandbags with him when they buried 6 soldiers in 1 week. He tapped call. She answered on the second ring. "Whitmore." Her voice was as crisp and calm as he remembered. "Yes, ma'am," Jack replied. "I hate to call like this, but I've just been denied boarding on a paid first-class ticket." Gate agent said my military status flagged the seat. She wouldn't review the documents. I'm going to miss Sergeant Rios's funeral. There was a silence on the other end, but not hesitation. Just that slight pause that came before deliberate action. Are you at the airport now, she asked. Denver International, Gate 42, Flight 2178 to Washington, just left without me. Marissa Delaney's tone changed. Cold, decisive. You're telling me a Medal of Honor recipient was denied a paid seat to attend a funeral at Arlington? Yes, ma'am. Understood. Stay where you are. This is about to be resolved. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't need to. Jack slid his phone back into the pouch and turned toward the gate area. Passengers nearby who had watched the earlier confrontation now glanced up as if sensing something different, something shifting. A few kept glancing toward Jack. The Medal of Honor around his neck was no longer just decoration. It was a symbol that something had gone deeply wrong. 9 minutes later, the hum of boarding calls and background announcements cut out. Every terminal screen flickered. The usual rotating schedules froze, then changed in unison. All aircraft movement temporarily suspended by federal order. Remain in terminal until further notice. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A woman clutched her boarding pass tighter. Children stopped fidgeting. Flight attendants exchanged uncertain glances. A TSA agent approached the counter with urgency, followed by 2 men in black suits holding federal credentials. One of them wore an earpiece. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He tapped the radio on his shoulder, nodded toward the tarmac, and stepped aside. And then came the SUVs. From the large glass windows, a convoy of sleek black government vehicles sped across the tarmac with synchronized precision. Emergency lights flickered, but didn't blare. There was no panic, just controlled power. Inside one of the vehicles was footage live showing General Delaney standing inside a Pentagon operations room. In it, she faced a panel of FAA officials and senior staff. This isn't about protocol, she said calmly. It's about precedent. If a Medal of Honor recipient traveling to bury a fallen brother is denied his seat because of a flawed flag, then the system needs to stop right now. Her voice cut through any hesitation in the room. The order was given. The screen darkened. Back in Denver, the terminal had shifted from background noise to stunned silence. People were standing now, phones held low, unsure what they were witnessing. The moment was cinematic, and the man at the center of it stood silently, his back straight, his uniform neat, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Jack didn't ask for any of this, but sometimes dignity doesn't come from shouting, it comes from standing your ground until someone with power remembers what honor looks like. And today, General Delaney remembered. The scene at Gate 42 had gone from routine to surreal in less than 10 minutes. Passengers gathered in small clusters, whispering theories and watching the monitors. Some thought it was a drill. Others thought there was a national emergency. But no alarms were sounding. No evacuations. Just a creeping sense that something bigger than anyone could see was unfolding right here in front of them. And then the men in black arrived. 2 black-clad federal agents identifiable only by their Department of Homeland Security DHS badges, and the unmistakable calm of authority strode toward the gate counter. They moved without hesitation, parting the crowd as they approached the desk where Alyssa Kerr was typing away, still oblivious to the storm gathering behind her. The older of the 2 agents, a woman with gray streaks in her bun and eyes that had seen more than they let on, stepped forward. Ms. Alyssa Kerr, she asked evenly. Alyssa looked up, confusion wrinkling her brow. Yes, Agent Rebecca Martinez, DHS, she said, holding up her badge. We need to speak with you immediately regarding your interaction with Colonel Jack Whitmore. Alyssa's practiced corporate confidence faltered. She glanced toward her supervisor's empty office. I was just following airline policy. The second agent, a younger man with a tablet already in hand, tapped the screen. We have a copy of your gate activity log and surveillance footage, he said. Your statement doesn't match the data. By now, a growing group of passengers was filming the interaction. One man whispered, "That's the lady who kicked out the veteran." Another murmured, "That's the guy with the Medal of Honor." Within minutes, that sentence would become a hashtag. Colonel Whitmore stood a few feet back, watching silently. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't even angry. Just solemn, like a man watching something break that had been fractured for a long time. The airline manager finally arrived, rushed, sweating phone in hand. He moved with all the urgency of someone who had just gotten a call from corporate headquarters that started with the words, "What the hell happened, Colonel Whitmore?" He said breathlessly. "Sir, please accept our sincerest apologies for the misunderstanding." Jack turned to face him. "It wasn't a misunderstanding," he said quietly. "It was a judgment." The manager fumbled. "Of course, yes. We're deeply sorry for the treatment you received. We're reinstating your original reservation, and we'd like to offer you complimentary first-class service for life." A murmur spread through the crowd, but Jack didn't even blink. "I didn't come here looking for perks," he replied. "I came here to bury a man who saved my life, and now I'm late." The manager swallowed hard. "Understood, sir. Please know we're conducting an internal investigation, and Ms. Kerr has been suspended pending review." Suspension wouldn't be enough, because what came next wasn't just corporate response, it was a cultural reckoning. By 7:00 p.m., video clips of the incident had been uploaded to every major platform. A 19-second clip showing Alyssa's smirk and the words "shiny metals don't mean first class" had already passed 3 million views. The hashtags "Metals Matter" or "Chown Honor Denied" and "Gate 42" trended within the hour. Veterans groups across the country began sharing the footage with calls for accountability, not just for Alyssa, but for how companies treat service members quietly without cameras. Some public comments were compassionate. "That man wore the Medal of Honor. You don't even have to know his name, you just salute." Others were furious. "This is what happens when we teach customer service, but not human decency." Not all commentary was civil. Some accused the colonel of pulling rank. Others claimed the airline overreacted. But for every dissenting voice, there were dozens who understood the deeper issue. The divide wasn't just about policy, it was about principle. And by midnight, the airline released a public statement acknowledging it. "We deeply regret the unacceptable treatment of Colonel Jack Whitmore at Gate 42. We have issued a formal apology and are launching mandatory training for all frontline staff focused on veteran awareness and proper conduct toward those who have served." The words helped, but they couldn't erase the sting of what had already happened. She was escorted from the terminal less than an hour after the agents arrived. There were no protests, no dramatic farewells, just a box of her things and a long walk through a hallway of strangers who now recognized her face from their phones. Her final defense, "I was just doing my job," fell flat against the footage, the receipts, and the public reaction. She had made a judgment call, and now the public was making one in return. As the story gained traction, news crews reached out to Jack for comment. He gave none. When asked by an airline representative if he would reconsider the lifetime benefit offer, he said, "The only seat that matters to me is the one I was trying to sit in today. I don't need compensation. I need a country that remembers what this medal means." Before boarding the reinstated flight, Jack nodded to the few passengers who offered quiet words of thanks. He said nothing as he passed the gate. But those who watched him go would not forget the moment a man who could have demanded everything chose only to stand for what was right. He didn't ask to be a symbol, but now for millions watching, he already was. The aircraft touched down at Reagan National Airport just after midnight. A military escort, unmarked SUVs that flanked the tarmac, had guided the flight all the way from Denver. No passengers clapped upon landing. No fanfare. Just quiet acknowledgement of something larger than air travel. The man in seat 2A wasn't just a passenger anymore. He was a symbol of sacrifice, of silence, broken of honor, long overdue. Colonel Jack Whitmore disembarked without a word, his duffel over one shoulder, his service cap in hand. The Medal of Honor around his neck caught the faint terminal lights casting a flicker against the polished floor as he walked with deliberate steps through the early morning quiet. By the time the sun began to rise, casting a golden wash over the Potomac River, Jack stood alone at Section 60 of Arlington National Cemetery. He'd been here before for fellow soldiers, for old friends. But this was different. This was for David Rios, the man who had taken 3 bullets in Fallujah, so Jack could live. David had been more than a squad leader. He had been Jack's moral compass when everything around them fell apart. A quiet warrior never interested in medals or commendations. He didn't ask questions when orders came down. He just made sure the men beside him got home. Except, of course, he hadn't come home whole. After Iraq, David fought battles that didn't make headlines, night terrors, migraines, the pain in his leg that never let up. And when the VA lost his paperwork for the 3rd time in a year, he had looked Jack in the eyes and said, "I think I'm fighting the wrong war now." Jack had promised him he wouldn't face it alone. Now, 18 years later, David lay beneath the soil of the country he served with full military honors, a flag-draped casket, and a widow left to carry the weight of silence. The honor guard performed with flawless precision. Rifles cracked in salute. A lone bugle played taps in the soft wind that rolled across the hills. Jack stood among the gathered crowd in full dress, blue shoulders, square eyes forward. When the ceremony ended and mourners stepped forward to pay final respects, David's widow Elena approached Jack with red-rimmed eyes but a voice steady from years of holding everything together. "Colonel Whitmore," she said, offering a small folded flag. "He always said you were the reason he lived as long as he did." Jack accepted the flag with hands that trembled not from weakness, but from memories too sharp to fade. "I didn't save him," Jack replied quietly. "He saved me. He gave me 20 more years of life. A seat on a plane was the least I could fight for." Elena nodded, understanding more than words could say. Behind her stood David's 3 children, all in dark coats, eyes searching Jack's face. The youngest, maybe 10, stepped forward and saluted. Jack returned the gesture, eyes misting. Later, as the guests dispersed and the groundsmen began the quiet task of preserving dignity in stone, Jack remained behind. He knelt beside the fresh grave, removed his cap, and placed it on his knee. "I kept my promise, brother," he whispered. The wind stirred the leaves above. "I made it." As Jack walked away from the gravesite, his mind wandered not to the confrontation at the gate, but to a broader thought: how many others had been quietly dismissed over the years, veterans with medals tucked in drawers. Widows told their paperwork was incomplete. Men and women who had stepped forward when their country needed them, only to return home to indifference dressed as policy. He didn't want to be the face of protest, but maybe, just maybe, what happened in that terminal could spark something real, something lasting. He reached the perimeter fence where the noise of traffic hummed faintly. A reporter stood nearby, quietly respectful, not pressing for a statement. But Jack turned to him just once. "Make sure they understand," he said. "Service isn't about privilege. It's about sacrifice. And that doesn't end just because the war does." Then he turned back toward the car waiting for him. Not a limousine, not a convoy. Just a simple black sedan sent by an old friend at the Pentagon. The kind of quiet thank you that didn't need headlines. As the car pulled away, Jack looked out the window at the endless rows of white headstones. Each one a name. Each one a story. And for one day, maybe for longer, the nation had remembered what those names were worth. Why do veterans, especially decorated ones, still face such treatment? That question lingers long after the uniform is folded, the bugle fades, and the headline disappears. What happened to Colonel Jack Whitmore at Gate 42 wasn't just a moment of inconvenience. It was a reflection of a broader, unsettling truth. For all the flags flown and pledges made, the cultural divide between military and civilian America has never been wider. Most Americans have never served in uniform. Fewer than 7% of living Americans are veterans today. And of that number, even fewer wear visible signs of their service. Many don't talk about it. They don't expect recognition. And they certainly don't demand it. That humility, while noble, often becomes the very reason they're overlooked, forgotten, or, like in Jack's case, dismissed as if their sacrifices have an expiration date. The gate agent's comment medals, "Don't buy first class," wasn't just cruel. It was emblematic of a deeper, bureaucratic indifference that veterans routinely navigate. Not just in airports, but in VA hospitals, housing applications, job interviews, and even classrooms. "Thank you for your service" has in many places become a phrase so automatic it's lost meaning, uttered with good intentions, but followed by zero action. There is an emotional toll that comes with being thanked by the same system that then puts you on hold for 6 hours to refill PTSD medication, or delays your claim for disability benefits for 18 months, or sends you to 3 different offices just to process paperwork for a fallen brother's funeral. Veterans learn to endure. But they shouldn't have to endure indifference. There's also a cultural gap, not one born from malice, but from detachment. In civilian life, service is often abstract. Sacrifice is hypothetical. Memorial Day is a day off, not a day of mourning. And when veterans like Jack step into public spaces wearing symbols of sacrifice like the Medal of Honor, they're sometimes met with suspicion, envy, or ignorance. It's easier for some to believe they're asking for special treatment than to accept they've already earned it. The result, veterans are forced to prove themselves over and over again, long after their uniforms should have spoken for them. And yet, amid the apathy, there are moments of honor. Programs like Honor Flights bring aging veterans to Washington to see their memorials, often for the first time. Schools teach lessons about service. Young children salute at parades, and strangers sometimes pay for meals in quiet gratitude. But those gestures, while powerful, are not a substitute for systemic respect. It's not just about free flights or reserved parking. It's about listening when veterans say, "I need help." It's about believing them when they talk about the invisible wounds. It's about having their back not just in combat, but when they're battling bureaucracy back home. Colonel Jack Whitmore didn't want special treatment. He wanted dignity. He wanted to honor a fallen friend. And when that right was denied, he responded not with rage, but with resolve. And maybe that's the bigger lesson. True honor isn't loud. It doesn't need to shout. But when it's ignored, when we pretend that service ends at discharge, then we as a nation forget who we are. Veterans are not props for parades. They are not stories for holidays. They are men and women who carried this country forward when it couldn't walk on its own. And in return, they deserve more than automated apologies and vague promises. They deserve to be seen. And more importantly, they deserve to be remembered while they're still standing. Colonel Jack Whitmore never raised his voice. He didn't argue, threaten, or demand attention. Yet in his silence, his restraint, he became a symbol of something far greater than any medal could ever represent. He became a reminder that dignity doesn't need volume to be powerful, that honor, when ignored, has a way of revealing the cracks in our systems, and that sometimes the quietest man in the room is the one who's carried the heaviest weight. The image of Jack standing at that gate, calm, steady, humiliated, but not broken, stayed with many. It wasn't the confrontation that captured the world's attention. It was the contrast. A man who had bled for his country refused a seat by someone who didn't know his name, and then watched an entire airport stop because someone finally remembered who he was. But this story isn't just about Jack, it's about us. Would you have spoken up at that gate? Would you have stepped forward when the man in uniform was told medals don't buy first class? Or would you have looked down at your phone and stayed silent? These moments, small as they seem, are mirrors. They reflect how we treat those who sacrifice the most. And if we're honest, too often we let those moments slip by. We can do better. So let's bring the conversation home. Have you ever witnessed someone in uniform being disrespected or quietly honored in a powerful way? Do you think we've grown too comfortable forgetting who built the freedoms we now enjoy? What does respect look like in modern America? And are we giving enough of it to those who earned it the hard way? We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Whether it's a memory from your own service, a loved one's story, or even a simple moment in a grocery store or waiting room, your voice matters. And to everyone who stayed until the end of this story, thank you. Thank you for giving your time to something that isn't trending, but is timeless. Thank you for caring about the difference between uniform silence and earned honor. And thank you for remembering. If this story moved you, we encourage you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes that respect isn't old-fashioned, it's overdue. Because the next time someone like Jack is told to step aside, maybe someone in the crowd will remember this moment and choose to step forward instead. That's how honor lives on.